Hi, Miss Nikki here. We're going to talk about Chapter 14, which is the autonomic nervous system. You can see the two divisions here. We have a parasympathetic and a sympathetic. Most people think of parasympathetic as turning things down, like rest and digest. We'll learn a little bit more about this system. And then sympathetic as the fight or flight, basically turning everything on or up. What I want you to realize is, for the most part, all of the organs are innervated by both systems. So both systems, if we want to turn up activity or we want to turn down activity, we're going to have to use one of these systems, either parasympathetic or sympathetic. So it would make sense that your lungs have both parasympathetic and sympathetic nervous system fibers. All right, let's get into Chapter 14. So what is the autonomic nervous system? You can see that it innervates smooth cardiac muscle and glands, and it is a motor division, right? So some sort of action is going to take place. It operates via subconscious control. So you do not have direct control over your heart, meaning you don't have to spend every second of the day saying, okay, heart beat, okay, beat again, beat slower, beat faster. Your brain takes care of that activity subconsciously. Sometimes you'll hear it called the general visceral motor system. Remember, in that first figure, we're seeing that these neurons innervate organs, and motor means action. Let's follow this figure. This was all the way back in Chapter 11. We can see central nervous system here. This was the brain and the spinal cord, right? This was Chapter 12 content. And then you can see the arrow going out to the peripheral nervous system. This was anything that came out the intervertebral foramen. You can think of this as a spinal nerve coming out of the spinal cord. You can see the arrow going down, and we looked at the motor division. We specifically looked at somatic nervous system. Somatic meaning whole body. And we looked at neuromuscular junctions where the nerves met the skeletal muscle fibers. So when I see somatic nervous system, I usually think skeletal and I think voluntary action. When I see autonomic nervous system over here, we just saw from the previous slide, this makes me think cardiac, smooth, glands, and this you should be thinking involuntary action. And you can see that there are two subdivisions, sympathetic and parasympathetic, and we'll talk about in more detail. If you're wondering about this sensory division, this is going to be Chapter 15. So what are we talking about? Sight, smell, sound. All of this is sensory information that goes to the spinal nerve, and then from the spinal nerve to the spinal cord, and then eventually to your brain. So we'll talk about those in Chapter 15. So you should be able to look at a figure like this and add information to it. Don't just look at it as a figure, but make sure that it makes sense to you and that you know where you've been in terms of lecture content, right? Now we need to see how the two systems differ. So first, effectors. In the somatic nervous system, the effectors are skeletal muscle, and we should remember voluntary. In the autonomic nervous system, the effectors are cardiac, smooth muscle, and glands, and we should be thinking involuntary action. The efferent pathways. So remember, efferent pathway is the neuron as it exits the spinal cord. So the efferent pathway for somatic is myelinated somatic motor fiber. Myelinated should tell you fast. Somatic should say body. Motor should say some sort of action. And when they say fiber, they're talking about a neuron. For the autonomic nervous system, there are two. There is a preganglionic and a postganglionic. If you remember the term ganglion, it's a bundle of somas, or cell bodies, from neurons, right? So there's a preganglionic neuron, and it's myelinated, which means it's fast. So this is the preganglionic, and it's fast. It has the myelin wrapped around it. Sorry, I'm not an artist, right? They have the ganglion, which is a collection of somas, or cell bodies from a neuron, and then you have an unmyelinated, which should tell you slow. So you have an unmyelinated post-axon. Why is it the axon? Well, because the soma is in the ganglion. So you have a fast preganglionic neuron and you have a slow or unmyelinated postganglionic axon. So what about the target organ? What's the target organ for the somatic nervous system? So all somatic motor neurons release acetylcholine. They're always stimulatory. We saw this at the neuromuscular junction, right? The synaptic knob or the axon terminal released acetylcholine, and that stimulated the acetylcholine receptors to open and allow sodium to come in and excite the skeletal muscle. With the autonomic nervous system, the pre's always release acetylcholine, and the posts have a choice. They can release either acetylcholine or norepinephrine. The effect is either stimulatory or inhibitory depending on the type of receptors on the target organ. This figure is a great representation of the complicated concepts that were on the last slide, trying to keep track of everything basically. So here's your somatic nervous system, and I said you should automatically think skeletal muscle. We've seen this before in chapter 9, right? Here we have the soma, here we have a myelinated axon, it releases acetylcholine, and it is stimulatory in that it causes muscle contraction. So there's only one neuron here. In the autonomic nervous system, we have sympathetic and parasympathetic. Notice that there are two, except for in this gland case, but it's causing a secondary action. What do you notice about all of the number ones in the autonomic nervous system? They're all myelinated. What else do you notice? They all release acetylcholine. So you always have a pre-neuron that's myelinated, and it releases acetylcholine. Here's the ganglion. Remember, what's the ganglion? It's a collection of somas. There's more than just one. This is a simplified version. What do you notice about all of the number twos? Unmyelinated, unmyelinated. Why do they say just axon instead of neuron? Well, because where's the soma? The soma is in the ganglion. So all of your posts are axons from a neuron, right? And they are unmyelinated. And what can they release? Either norepinephrine or acetylcholine. So if you have two different neurotransmitters, you could possibly have two modes of action. So you can either stimulate or inhibit based on the neurotransmitter and the receptor that's on the effector organ. So in some cases, norepinephrine is going to turn that particular target organ on or up. And in some cases, acetylcholine is going to be the excitatory neurotransmitter. This slide, I wanted to make sure that we understand that there is some sort of overlap between the skeletal and the autonomic nervous system. So your higher brain centers can regulate and coordinate both systems. You can come down and look at this example. If you're working out, if your muscles are active, they're going to require more oxygen and more glucose. So your autonomic nervous system is going to have to speed up your heart rate and open your airways so that you can breathe in more oxygen and move that oxygen and glucose to your muscles more quickly. So your spinal and your cranial nerves are going to be innervated with both somatic and autonomic fibers. When we look at parasympathetic, most people will refer to this as rest and digest. And when they see sympathetic, they will say fight or flight. For that reason, most people talk about sympathetic kind of turning on and parasympathetic as turning off. It's a little bit more complicated than that. Have to make sure that we understand that all visceral organs are duly innervated by both divisions. So you're going to have sympathetic and parasympathetic nerve fibers innervating all of your visceral organs, but these divisions cause an opposite effect. So the whole point is to maintain some sort of homeostasis. So if we're talking about parasympathetic and we're talking about the heart, it might cause your heart rate to slow down, like when you're trying to go to sleep. In your sympathetic nervous system, Those nerve fibers might actually stimulate your heart to beat faster if you're running a marathon. So they have opposite effects, dual innervation, and their whole purpose is to maintain homeostasis. Let's talk a little bit more about parasympathetic division. Basically, it conserves body energy. This is when we're in rest and digest. So we're going to lower blood pressure, heart rate, respiratory rate. So this is the rest part. And then your gastrointestinal tract, so this is your stomach and your intestines, right? Small intestines to be specific. That activity is really high. So this is the digest part where we're turning up activity. Your pupils are constricted and the lenses accommodate for close vision. So then they give you this nice illustration. Usually when we're thinking about parasympathetic, we think about a person who's just eaten a meal, they're relaxing, and they're reading a book. We'll talk more about lens and pupil constriction when we get to chapter 15. So think of decreased heart and respiratory rate that allows for digestion. What are we doing? We're funneling all of our blood and resources into food digestion. And we're trying to discard all of our waste. So let's look at sympathetic division a little bit more closely. This is fight or flight. So you're going to fight somebody or run away. I usually think of a giant bear's attacking me, right? I've got to decide, am I going to run away or am I going to fight it? So blood flow is shunted to the skeletal muscles and to the heart. I would need that if I'm going to do either fight or flight. Bronchioles are going to dilate. We're talking about the lungs, and this allows for an increase in oxygen. We're also going to release glucose. Hopefully by now we're thinking about cellular respiration. Why do we need glucose and more oxygen? We're hoping to make tons of ATP. So we can do what? Skeletal muscles and heart need ATP in order to function, right? So increasing heart and respiratory rate and inhibiting digestion and elimination. I make a point of saying this because if you're in fight or flight, if you're in your sympathetic nervous system, we're going to turn on all of these areas, but we're going to inhibit the stomach. When we say elimination, we could be talking about the large intestines. We could also be talking about the kidneys. So basically, if you're trying to run away from the bear that's attacking you, you don't want to have to stop and urinate or defecate. And you don't want blood to go to your stomach to try to digest food. You want all of your reserves going to your skeletal muscle and your heart so that you can get away from whatever's chasing you. We need to notice a few more differences between the sympathetic and the parasympathetic. And the first one we're going to look at are the site or origins of the nerve fibers. So the parasympathetic come out of the brain and the sacral area. The sympathetic come out of the thoracic and the lumbar region. Next difference is the length of the fibers. So the parasympathetic have long pre's and short posts. The sympathetic have short pre's and long posts. And I'll explain why on another slide over here. Also the location of the ganglia. If we're talking about the parasympathetic ganglia, these are located near the organs. And if you look at the sympathetic, they're closer to the spinal cord. Here's a nice figure for you to reference, but I think the figure on the next page makes it a little bit more clear. Okay, let's look at the origin of fibers. So in the parasympathetic, where do the fibers originate from? The cranial and the sacral region. Sympathetic, what is the origin of the fibers? Thoracic and lumbar region. So number one was origin. Number two was length. Do you notice that the para, we have the pre's that are long and the posts which are short. For the sympathetic, we have pre's that are short and the posts are long. The third was the location of the ganglion. Here, where's the ganglion? Right? It's the area where the two neurons meet, or a collection of somas. It's closer to the organ. Here's the ganglion. It's closer to the spinal cord. We'll learn why in just a moment, but what you should see is the parasympathetic, I call it more specific. So if I have a nerve coming out of the sacral region, it goes directly to the organ before it synapses with the post-ganglionic neuron or post-ganglionic axon. You can see that the sympathetic kind of has this hub, and that the origin of a neuron, it can travel up and down this hub and go out to multiple organs all at the same time. So if you think of parasympathetic as off and sympathetic as on, we might want to turn on multiple organs at the same time. But if we're going to turn something off, we want to be very specific. Let's look at an enlarged version of parasympathetic. So here are our cranial nerves. Hopefully you remember these. This one is ocular motor. This one is facial. This one is glossopharyngeal. And this one was the vagus. And if you remember, the vagus nerve is the only cranial nerve that innervates into the thoracic and abdominal cavity. You can see that most of these cranial nerves are going to synapse at the ganglion and have something to do with the head and neck region of the body. So again, we have our pre-ganglionic neuron, we have our post-ganglionic neuron. You can also see these plexes or branching. As we come off of the vagus nerve, we travel down and you have the preganglionic nerve go into the organ where it synapses with the post. So you can see the very short post-ganglionic neurons here. I also want you to notice that you can see this branching, or the plexus, and they kind of seem to join together. So in this area, your cardiac and your pulmonary can both be turned down at the same time. And if you notice all of the plexus here, the celiac plexus, all of this branching can be used to turn up digestive action. And remember, parasympathetic is rest and digest. Here's an enlarged view of the sympathetic nervous system. And again, remember that the preganglionic nerve fibers originate from the thoracic and the lumbar, but I want to draw your attention to this sympathetic trunk ganglion, or sometimes just sympathetic ganglia. So here we have lots of somas, right? Or cell bodies of your post-ganglionic neurons. So these are all pre's, and you can see the synapse site, and these are all post-ganglionic neurons. What I want to show you is that messages, the pre can go into the sympathetic ganglion trunk, and the messages can go up or down. This is almost like a car, and the car gets on the highway. And then once you're on the highway, you can go north or south, and then you can get off at a specific exit. So if I just draw a line here and here, we kind of have the same version or branching, the plexuses, that come off, and they seem to coordinate with specific areas. So you can see any message that comes off of this sympathetic ganglia in this area is going to go directly to the heart and the lung. And we know with sympathetic, if we're talking fight or flight, that we're going to have an increase in heart rate, and we're going to have dilation of the bronchioles in order to get more oxygen. And if you look at this section below the line, again, you can see more ganglion. We have our pre, they're synapsing at the ganglion, and now we have our post. And you can see that the post-ganglion goes to all of these, except for adrenal medulla. I'll come back and talk about that. But all of these actions, which are going to have something to do with decreasing, right? We don't want to have to stop to digest food. We don't want unwanted blood flow to those areas. We're trying to provide our skeletal muscle and our cardiac muscle with enough energy to fight or flight. So we decrease all of our digestive function. We also decrease urinary function. So here we have the bladder. So that's also going to be decreased. The only one that's different here, you might be able to see this, is here is a pre. It goes through this celiac ganglion, and then you'll notice that out to the adrenal medulla that this should be a post, but it's actually dark green, trying to tell you it's a preganglionic. So this is a little bit different. Pre comes through the ganglion and the pre continues on to the adrenal medulla. This is the only area where there is no postganglionic neuron. Some people say the organ itself is the postganglionic neuron. If you remember from the other picture, we showed you a preganglionic neuron going into the medulla, and what comes out? Epinephrine and norepinephrine, right? So there is no postganglionic neuron going to the adrenal medulla. It's only a pre. Now that we've covered the basics of sympathetic and parasympathetic, we need to talk about reflexes, and specifically visceral reflexes, because they're different than somatic. Hopefully with somatic, you remember if you stepped on a nail and then you lifted your foot, so it was a stereotyped automatic response. You don't have to go to your brain for processing. So remember, the integration center is in your spinal cord. So reflex, this is immediate stereotyped response in the spinal cord. So no brain integration. Okay, there are differences between the visceral and the somatic. So the visceral reflex has 2 consecutive neurons, and the cell bodies are located either in the cranial nerve, or we're going to see the example in the dorsal root ganglion of the spinal cord. This image here, or this figure from your book, this is a visceral reflex arc. So as I said, we had 2 neurons here. First, you're going to have some sort of stimulus. That's going to activate a receptor in the viscera. Remember, this just means organs. You're going to have that information carried on a sensory nerve, and it's going to synapse here in the spinal cord. Remember, there's no brain integration here. So we don't want to waste time going to the brain to make a decision. This is an automatic, stereotyped reflex response. So the sensory information comes in, it synapses in the spinal cord, and we have another neuron that's going to carry out some sort of motor action to a particular organ or effector, and you're going to get a response. So one example would be smooth muscle of the esophagus. As soon as food is pushed by your tongue into your pharynx and then eventually your esophagus, you're going to have peristalsis. This is alternating contractions of smooth muscle. So what was it stimulated by? The food. As soon as the food enters the esophagus, this chain of events occurs, and what happens? Your smooth muscle is going to be contracted. Another example, if you have some sort of irritant in your lungs, you're breathing in some particles, it could cause you to cough. I was going to write choke, but cough first, hopefully not choking. And then number 3, what happens if you have some irritant in your stomach? So you've just ingested some food and the food's bad. You have tons of bacteria. You don't want it to be able to get into your bloodstream, so you could have a reflex action that causes us to remove that food product from the stomach, or vomiting. Now we get to move on to neurotransmitters. So remember that acetylcholine and norepinephrine are the 2 major neurotransmitters released by the autonomic nervous system. Acetylcholine is going to be released by all preganglionic axons and by all postganglionic axons of the parasympathetic nervous system. Norepinephrine is released by almost all sympathetic postganglionic axons. So we're going to look at each of these in a little bit more detail. If the last slide was confusing to you, you need to pull this figure up and make sure that you can pinpoint when acetylcholine is released and when norepinephrine is released. So you can see acetylcholine here being released. So it says all preganglionic neurons of the autonomic nervous system, and specifically just the postganglionic axon of the parasympathetic system. For the sympathetic, we can see that all posts are going to release norepinephrine. Now we're going to discuss receptors. So remember, receptors are proteins. These proteins are made by cells, and we're talking about the types of receptors that bind acetylcholine, and it's got the word choline in it. So basically, acetylcholine will bind to these cholinergic receptors, and this will cause some sort of action in the body. Well, there are two types of receptors. There's a nicotinic and there's a muscarinic. So you can have two different types of cholinergic receptors. One is nicotinic, one is muscarinic. Where do we find nicotinic receptors? This is the first type. So remember, we're talking about acetylcholine binding. Acetylcholine can bind to a nicotinic receptor. Where do you find them? They're on all postganglionic neurons. Remember, the pre has to release acetylcholine. Well, that acetylcholine has to be able to trigger the post neuron to fire. So all postganglionic neurons have to have nicotinic receptors that acetylcholine can bind to. Also the adrenal medulla, also the skeletal muscles of the cell. Remember that acetylcholine binds to the acetylcholine receptor when we talked about muscle contraction, but we didn't tell you what type of receptor. We're telling you now. It's a nicotinic receptor. Nicotinic acetylcholine receptor, if you want to be very specific. The effect of acetylcholine at nicotinic receptor is always stimulatory. It's going to open ion channels. We saw this in contraction. It's going to cause depolarization of either a muscle, or it could be any postsynaptic cell. Remember, synapse is the site where a neuron meets another neuron, or a neuron meets a muscle. We call it a neuromuscular junction in that case. So what about the second type, the muscarinic receptors? These are found on all effector cells that are stimulated by postganglionic cholinergic fibers. So if it's releasing acetylcholine, you should have a muscarinic receptor on those effector cells. So these can inhibit or excite, so you can turn on or off, and it depends on the receptor type of the organ cell. For example, binding of acetylcholine to cardiac muscle cells actually slows the heart rate down, whereas binding to intestinal smooth muscle increases motility. Okay, if the last two slides just threw you into a tailspin, let's go back and just recap. So we know parasympathetic, these pre-ganglionic neurons all release acetylcholine, and we know that the posts release acetylcholine. What we were trying to say is the post has to have a receptor for acetylcholine. If the pre is going to release acetylcholine, what's the only way that the post can respond? It must have an acetylcholine receptor. Well, we said those specific acetylcholine receptors are nicotinic acetylcholine receptors. So we said all postganglionic neurons have acetylcholine receptors, specifically nicotinic. We also said the adrenal medulla. When I say all post, I'm talking about sympathetic as well. Remember, the pre's here, they release acetylcholine, so the post has to have an acetylcholine receptor, specifically nicotinic. And then we said the adrenal gland. Remember, the adrenal gland is that oddball that only has a pre. So all postganglionic neurons have acetylcholine receptors, specifically nicotinic, plus we're going to add the adrenal medulla to that list. We also mentioned skeletal muscle. So those are all the nicotinic acetylcholine receptors. When we talk about the muscarinic acetylcholine receptors, we said they were on the effector cells stimulated by post-ganglionic neurons. Well, remember, this pre-releases acetylcholine. The post for parasympathetic also releases acetylcholine, and that causes action on an organ. So they're saying the effector cells of the organ stimulated by the postganglionic neuron have to have muscarinic acetylcholine receptors. So the bladder, the genitals, the liver, the pancreas, the stomach, the lungs, the heart, they all have acetylcholine receptors, but specifically muscarinic. Keep in mind, what do the parasympathetic posts release? They all release norepinephrine, right? So we're not going to talk about the post-ganglionic neurons of the sympathetic nervous system because that'll come up when we talk about norepinephrine. So you should be able to use this figure to go back and look at the previous two slides and hopefully have this make a little bit more sense. So I want to talk about surgery and why you should care about these different receptor types. So we have the nicotinic acetylcholine receptors, and basically you would find those receptors on skeletal muscle. Then we talked about the muscarinic acetylcholine receptors, and we said we find those in cardiac and smooth muscle. So when you go into surgery, we want to stop skeletal muscle movement, right? We want to inhibit skeletal muscle movement while you're on the table. But we don't want your heart to stop, and we don't want your blood vessels to stop pumping blood. So these two together work your cardiovascular system. So we can give you a drug that blocks just your nicotinic acetylcholine receptors. So it blocks just the receptors to your skeletal muscle, and it allows your muscarinic to work. So it's important to know the difference of some of these neurotransmitters and these receptors. When you get into drug interaction, especially if you continue on in allied health, it will be important to understand this fundamental basic concept of different receptors that respond to the same neurotransmitter, and that those receptors are located in different parts of the body. So we have talked about acetylcholine and the different types of receptors. Now we get to talk about the different types of receptors for norepinephrine or epinephrine. Adrenergic. Strange, but you can see adrenal gland in this, and you can also see adrenaline. So these receptors, there's two different types. There's an alpha and beta, and there's several subtypes. Depending on which subclass of receptor is in the target organ. For example, norepinephrine binds to cardiac muscle, and specifically beta receptors can cause an increase in heart rate. Whereas when epinephrine binds a beta-2 receptor, it can cause bronchial relaxation. So epinephrine binds to an epinephrine receptor, but it could be of the alpha or beta variety. Back to this figure, right? So here we're in sympathetic, and remember the post for sympathetic is going to release norepinephrine or epinephrine. So we're saying all of these target organs, except for the adrenal medulla, we're saying these target organs can have either alpha or beta receptors. Let's review some of the neurotransmitters and receptors and then look at some of the drug interactions. So what's normal? If you have acetylcholine It will bind to one of the two types of acetylcholine receptors. In this case, let's look at muscarinic. So acetylcholine bind the muscarinic receptor. Oops, I misspelled there. And it will cause inhibition, decrease in cardiac muscle contraction. So what happens if I give you atropine? Atropine will block this pathway. So instead of having a decreased cardiac muscle, instead you're going to have increased cardiac muscle contraction. So atropine causes an increase in cardiac muscle because you're blocking the normal pathway. Now look at norepinephrine. Here are the different alpha and beta receptors for norepinephrine to bind. So a beta blocker would disrupt this normal pathway between norepinephrine and the receptor. So normal, you'd have norepinephrine. It would bind the beta receptor, and that would cause an increase in your heart rate. Your heart would beat faster. So why would you want to block the connection between norepinephrine and a beta receptor? We call that a beta blocker. What happens if you have some sort of heart block? What happens if your heart is already pumping too fast? So if we block the beta receptor and the norepinephrine, what happens to your heart rate? It goes down. Some of them make a little bit more sense once you get to 202 and we talk about cardiac output and heart rate and stroke volume and lots of other more complicated concepts. But for right now, I just want you to see that the neurotransmitters and the receptors make a difference, and where those receptors are located makes a difference. So what about alpha blockers? So we'd have norepinephrine going to an alpha receptor, and we said this normally constricts blood vessels. So if you constrict blood vessels, that makes your blood pressure high. So if I were to block this norepinephrine and alpha receptor pathway, what would happen to my blood pressure? So this would be increased blood pressure. If I turn off this pathway, what's going to happen to my blood pressure? It's going to go down. So if somebody has hypertension, we could give them an alpha blocker. Hopefully that made a little bit of sense to you. Read through this slide, and again, I want you to understand the neurotransmitter, the receptor types, and where those receptors are located and what they can do. I want you to be aware of these terms, sympathetic tone and parasympathetic tone. Basically what they're saying is that certain neurons from the sympathetic and parasympathetic control specific areas of the body. So sympathetic tone, we're talking about the blood vessels, or specifically the smooth muscle of all blood vessels. So they call this vasomotor tone. You have a partial constriction of your blood vessels. So think of blood vessels, think of blood pressure. You want to be able to keep your blood pressure constant so that you can get the blood from your aorta, from your heart, out to your fingers and your toes. If your blood vessels were flabby, you would not be able to do this. Parasympathetic tone controls the normal rhythm of the heart, the smooth muscles specifically of the digestive and urinary tract organs. So we're talking about the stomach, the intestines, the bladder, the urethra, the ureters, those hollow, smooth muscle organs. So that would be parasympathetic tone, a continual state of partial constriction of these organs. But they want you to understand that during times of stress, fight, or flight, that your sympathetic division can take over all of these. So remember, even though we said this is normally controlled by parasympathetic, your sympathetic can take control and have your heart speed up, right? It can also cause the smooth muscle of your digestive and urinary tract organs to decrease while you're trying to do fight or flight. Let's look at the control of the autonomic nervous system. Where does this happen? It's controlled by your central nervous system. So your brainstem, your spinal cord, hypothalamus, cerebral cortex. Specifically, usually we talk about the hypothalamus is the main integrative part or center of the autonomic nervous system. So your hypothalamus is going to control heart activity, blood pressure, temperature, water balance, endocrine, so think of hormone activity. emotional response through the limbic system, right, to activate this fight or flight. This figure here just showing you a visual representation of what we just talked about. So the limbic system, that's the emotional brain. It can trigger the autonomic nervous system, like getting stage fright. Here we have the hypothalamus. This is the boss. It's the overall integration center of the autonomic nervous system. Then we have the brain. Remember, we have the pons and the medulla oblongata. They're going to regulate pupil size and respiration and heart and blood pressure and swallowing. We call those the survival functions of the pons and the medulla oblongata. And then in the spinal cord is where we're going to have our reflexes. So reflexes for urination, defecation, erection, ejaculation, all of this will come in 202. We'll talk about digestion, we'll talk about urinary, and we'll talk about reproduction. We need to talk about the enteric nervous system. This will be covered in chapter 23 in 202, but I want to mention that the digestive system has its own nervous system. So it's composed of hundreds of millions of neurons. Some sources will say up to 500 million neurons found in the walls of the digestive tract. There are no components found in the central nervous system, brain, and spinal cord. Specifically, when the vagus nerve is cut, that these enteric neurons still fire, so they don't have a central nervous system component. They have their own reflex arcs, and they're believed to have something to do with the motility of the viscera, the organs, and the secretion of digestive enzymes, and that they work in concert with the autonomic nervous system, parasympathetic and sympathetic. Next two slides talk about clinical homeostatic imbalance. Many autonomic nervous system disorders involve deficient control of smooth muscle activity, like in hypertension where you have high blood pressure. Basically, you have overactive sympathetic vasoconstrictors that respond to stress. The heart's got to work harder, the arterial walls have increased wear and tear or pressure on them, and we can treat them by these norepinephrine receptor blocking drugs that we talked about earlier. On the next slide, there's two more homeostatic imbalances that you can look at. Again, we keep seeing this over and over again. As we age, we see a decline in activity. So in the autonomic nervous system, that would have something to do with digestion, in this case, constipation. You could also see something with smooth muscle. We're going to see orthostatic hypertension or low blood pressure after changing positions. You might know an elderly person when they are in a sitting position and they stand up, they might feel a little dizzy or lightheaded. That has to do with pressure receptors that are less responsive to blood pressure changes. And then you can also have cardiovascular centers that are not able to maintain a healthy blood pressure. I hope you've enjoyed chapter 14. It is a relatively small chapter. Just make sure you focus on some of the highlights that we've talked about, including the neurotransmitters, the difference between sympathetic and parasympathetic, the different types of receptors, and the different action. So please look at the exam review questions or the learning objective questions and make sure that you can answer those. I'll see you next chapter. Bye.